So we concluded the last day looking at how to reduce driving externalities. That how we have a resource that's out there, but if the resource is overused at particular times, everybody suffers. So during rush or peak hours, you can have excess traffic on the road, and then at other hours the road can be underutilised. So it would be beneficial if you could spread or distribute the utilisation of the resource over a more even period. So Singapore uses a system of intelligent tolls. So you're charged a toll for using the road, and the toll varies by the time of day and the amount of traffic. Might not be the most popular system, but it is one that has been implemented in Singapore. And efforts to implement something similar have been done in other cities, but they have largely used fixed prices, which may not be the most appropriate. A second externality we've looked at in detail is pollution. So how might we go about reducing the pollution? So we've seen that competitive markets produce too much negative externalities. Government intervention may provide a social gain. So if government has sufficient knowledge about pollution damage, the demand for the good, the cost of the good, and the production technology, it can force a competitive market to produce the socially optimum output. So one way the government can do it is control pollution directly by limiting the amount of pollution, quotas or limits, etc., or taxing firms for the pollution they create to sort of internalise the cost that the pollution creates. The whole problem with the externality is that the cost occurs for society, but unless it appears on the firm's accounts, they're not going to adapt and change to it. So we're left with sort of a trade-off. How do we resolve an externality problem? What are the costs and benefits? Who would be in favour of reducing or eliminating externality, and who would be opposed? So when it comes to any decision, you have to weigh up the costs and the benefits. So when it comes to an externality such as pollution, if you look at the private costs and private benefits which accrue to the firm, so what cost does a firm accrue from pollution itself? So the costs are almost nil. So it doesn't appear in its profit and loss statement, its balance sheet. There may be some costs in terms of the working environment or perhaps proximity to the pollution, but the cost of the firm will be pretty close to zero. The main costs will be borne by society. Environmental damage, reduction in air quality, water quality, and perhaps increases in illnesses and ill health. So be that waterborne or airborne illnesses, respiratory difficulties, whatever it might be, the costs will be borne by society. When it comes to the benefits, will be benefits on both sides. The benefits are the goods made by the firm will generate a profit for the shareholders, and the goods consumed by individuals will generate utility for them. So you have benefits for both. But the issue is that when it comes to society, we want all the costs and benefits to be considered. But when the firm is making its production decision, it weighs the benefits of profit against almost no cost for the externality. So it makes its decision over here. Society, when it's buying the good, would like to think that the price it pays reflects all the costs. But if the firm's profit is only measured in the cost of labour, the cost of raw material, the cost of capital, the price consumers are paying are reflecting the factors of production. So because factors of production are scarce, the price people are paying does reflect that. Is the good generating benefits sufficient to justify the raw materials, human capital, and monetary capital that have gone into its production? If it's yes, people will buy it. The problem with an externality is that there's a further cost for society that may not be taken into account. So how can we solve the pollution problem? Well, one way would be through mergers. Internalise the cost of the cooperative. Make the producers and the consumers the same. So they're all benefiting, they're all suffering the same costs and benefits. That is a very limited solution and will generally only work in a very local area where the producers, the consumers, and those suffering the externality are all the same. You could have social conventions, provision of education and information, tell people that something is bad. Unlikely to be very effective. But you could try to go through an information process. It can have some successes, but they do tend to be quite limited. So in Ireland there have been some social conventions that have changed and others that haven't. So over the last 25, 30 years, attitudes to drink driving in Ireland have changed, particularly amongst younger generations. It used to be relatively widely accepted, but now there is a growing acceptance that drink driving shouldn't be undertaken, and the convention has been changed. But in other areas where certain behaviours have costs, the behaviour mightn't change. So when it comes to smoking, the government has been for 30 or 40 years advertising about the dangers of smoking, yet the pure information itself doesn't seem to have much of an impact. So providing education, information, wasn't really working. So when it came to smoking, and particularly the externality from smoking, the whole costs of passive smoking, the government had to introduce direct regulation and ban smoking in public spaces. That even though there was huge amounts of information out there, it wasn't really being acted on. So sometimes the governments can undertake direct regulation. So the government can tell each polluter to reduce pollution by a certain amount or face legal sanctions. So again, this is placing limits on particular countries. If you want to look at a direct regulation such as this, you can look at the Kyoto Protocol, signed in the mid-1990s in the Japanese city of Kyoto, which had been devastated by an earthquake. And this was sort of this conference that was held there in the mid-1990s, but one way of saying that the city was open for business again. What did the Kyoto Protocol say to countries? It argued or proposed that they reduced their CO2 emissions to 1990 levels. And it was the same for every country. So whatever your CO2 emissions were in 1990, that was your benchmark. And there was the benchmark set relative to that. So it was the same for every country. So same for a highly industrialized, highly active country in 1990, and the same for a very poor country. However, efficiency does not require that all firms, or for the Kyoto Protocol, all countries, reduce their pollution equally. When it comes to efficiency, we're looking at costs versus benefits. The costs of benefits of pollution in all firms, all countries, may not necessarily be the same. So a regulation that mandates all people cut back by equal amounts may result in one firm having too much pollution and one having too little. So say if a developed country like the US goes back to 1990 levels, that still is allowing a fairly large level of economic activity, and perhaps their economy has shifted in the meantime. Back then they could have been based largely on heavy industry and manufacturing, on sectors that produced large amounts of CO2, but perhaps in the intervening years they've moved to more high tech, into more pharmaceutical, into software, into technology, which might not be so CO2 intensive. So naturally the US economy is actually moving away from it. Whereas then you might take a poorer country in 1990, and they might actually be looking to undertake the heavy industry, the highly labour intensive industry that might perhaps generate or also generate high levels of CO2. But if they stick by the agreement, they had no industry in 1990, very low CO2, they want to import industry in say 2010, but the Kyoto Protocol would limit it. So having a fixed mandate across all countries may not necessarily be the best step to take, because you're not looking at the costs and benefits. You might be increasing pollution in one country, but the benefits of that might far exceed the costs. The benefits could be people getting jobs, people getting employment, getting a standard of living, the ability to earn income. And it could simply be just a transfer of the CO2 emissions from one country to the next. So efficiency doesn't necessarily require. Of course, the US is continuing to increase its CO2 emissions. It might be losing some heavy industry, but its CO2 emissions continue to increase as it drives more and more and longer with cars, and also has huge issues with air conditioning. Perhaps we're not too much of an issue of it here with our temperate, moderate climate, and that's perhaps allowed us to attract cloud computing. One of the attractions for companies setting up cloud computing bases in Ireland is that when they have the huge servers, they can just put them into sheds. They don't need to regulate the temperatures. They don't need to have air conditioning running 24/7. Whereas if they built them in the US, it's likely that they go from extreme heat to extreme cold and be cooling the room in 1 month, heating it another, and suffering large costs. But homeowners in the US, industries, offices, all have huge amounts of air conditioning, which consumes huge amounts of energy. So building a city like Las Vegas in the middle of the desert makes no sense unless you're willing to pay to keep the indoor air cool. And the US is willing to pay the money, but the issue the world has is, are we willing to pay the environmental cost? Living in Florida, 35, 36 degrees for most of the summer. Who moves to Florida? The retirees of the US. Are they willing to hack and stick heat at that level? No. Again, most of the buildings will be air conditioned. They're willing to pay it. They have the money to pay it. But are they paying the cost in terms of the CO2 emissions? And have the US stood up to their, or lived by their requirements of the Kyoto Protocol? No. So the Kyoto Protocol has largely failed. It actually has expired. I think it's reaching its conclusion. I think it was the end of 2011. And there was supposed to be fines and punishments if you hadn't stuck to the original agreement. Got your CO2 emissions back to some level relative to 1990. But I doubt we'll ever see any of those fines or issues imposed. And there'll perhaps be another summit that will look to improve or adjust on some of the issues from the Kyoto Agreement. A second approach, rather than direct regulation where you limit the quantity, is to try to use taxes to affect the price. So a Pigouvian tax, after the English economist A.C. Pigou, so the first 5 letters there, an economist who came up with this idea, is a tax levied upon each unit of pollution. You could also term it an emissions fee. So how much pollution do you produce? Well, you pay in a tax or a charge for each amount. So the optimal tax is equal to the marginal damage to society at the efficient level of output. So the margin is just the next or the subsequent level of damage at the whatever the efficient level of output is. So there are a number of practical problems with the Pigouvian tax, most of which involve the information required. What level do we put the tax at? What is causing the pollution? How does it cause it? How much damage is caused? And then what should we put the tax on, and how much should be levied? So the government needs to know the impact of the pollution. So when it comes to CO2 emissions, is the debate fixed? Is CO2 causing global warming? Is Al Gore right? Was his Nobel Peace Prize justified? Should we be cutting back on CO2 emissions? Have the data been manipulated by those who are in favour of it? So you get a whole host of controversies. Is the science conclusive? So the United Nations has its IPCC, International Panel on Climate Control. It's a document that almost runs as long as the Mahan report. Not quite sure whether it's 3,250 pages long, but it is quite long. But again, it's a bit inconclusive. Is temperature rising? Perhaps. Is it down to man? Perhaps. We're not quite sure. And CO2 is a bit of an unusual one. We as creatures, as beings, in terms of our being, we blow out CO2. We are minor cars in terms of consuming oxygen. Our lungs then use that, convert it, and we largely blow out CO2. If you blow into a balloon and fill it up, tie a knot in the balloon and let the balloon go, where will it go? It'll fall. Yet CO2 is a greenhouse gas that's apparently supposed to hover around the top of the world. You'll see the pictures of the sunlight coming in through the Earth's atmosphere, bouncing off the sea, and then trying to get back out, but is deflected back down by the CO2. So the carbon dioxide is expected to, in a sense, cloak the world and keep the sunlight in, keeping the temperature and the heat within the planet, thereby causing global warming. Well, the one small problem is that carbon, as a atom, I'm not into science now, is heavier than the air it surrounds. So it may not necessarily float to the top. If you see smoke coming out of a chimney, it's rising. So you'd say, oh, well, it's definitely going up into the atmosphere. The one reason why the smoke is rising is because it's warm. It has been heated, but through convection will naturally rise. And then there's issues about the level of CO2 in the atmosphere. Parts per million. How much of the atmosphere is made up of CO2? I'll have to look up the exact figure, but parts per million. So if we had 1 million people, how many of them would be bad CO2? If I can find a reliable source. CO2 parts per million. We trust Wikipedia? You should never use it as a source, but it tells you where you can go and get the information. So what I'm looking for, parts per million, chlor F. I think I saw the answer anyway. So in the Earth's atmosphere, so carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere is considered a trace gas. Parts per million in November 2011, I think. So for every million units in the Earth's atmosphere, 390 of them are CO2. So there's 999,610 other things in the atmosphere for every 390 parts of CO2. It also shows that it's by mass, it's a bit larger, so why it's heavier. So by particles, there's 390 particles every million in the Earth's atmosphere. By mass, it's 591. So CO2 is, as I suggested, slightly heavier. So is something, so if, I think I worked that out. So I was saying 391 divided by 2. So it's 0.00391% of the atmosphere. If it was All-Ireland final day in Croke Park and there was 82,500 people there, carbon dioxide would be 32. So if one team has the support of 32 people, that would be the equivalent support or amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this whole debate about carbon emissions, CO2, is one that's very divisive. And one that leads to opposing arguments. Is Arctic ice contracting? Yes. Is the Arctic Ocean likely to be free of ice at some stage for longer periods of the year? Yes. So that would indicate a temperature rise. So we can say, look at it on one side, we can say, look for hard evidence. Are glaciers contracting? Yes. We can look at pictures taken in 1985, 1995, 2005 and say, here's the extent of the ice in given years. And you can see it contracting. Again, that'll largely be down to temperature change. Are the oceans going to rise by 20 feet? Well, no. Most of the ice that's melting, the vast majority of the ice, is Arctic ice. And the one issue with Arctic ice is it's in the Arctic Ocean. It already is in the sea. If you have a pint of cider full of ice and the ice melts, does the pint of cider start spilling? Ever see it happening? No, because the ice is in it. The volume is already there. The ice will just melt and the level will stay exactly the same. The big danger would be if Antarctic ice started melting, because Antarctic ice is largely on a continent. That is miles of ice sitting on land. If that melts, it flows into the sea. But at present, most of the ice has been limited to sea ice. In Antarctica, there has been substantial reductions in ice, but again, most of it has been on the sea. You'll see fairly dramatic pictures of ice shelves breaking up. So I think maybe 5-6 years ago, not quite sure of the name, but I think the Ross ice shelf was a huge body of ice that broke off Antarctica. Could have been the size of a country. But again, the impact of that, although largely dramatic and clearly as a result of temperature changes, the temperature is rising, I think, we can confirm on that. It won't have an impact on sea levels until land ice starts melting, and there's still no sign of dramatic changes there. So marine settings such as Cork City are likely safe for another while. So if we're going to levy a tax on this, if we can conclude one or the other, it does or it doesn't cost, or cause a problem. So any of that science stuff I've said for the last 50 minutes, completely ignore that. I'm not a scientist. I'm really throwing out common arguments that are put into the public domain that it is causing a problem, it isn't causing a problem. Don't trust me. So when it comes to the taxation, which activities produce pollutant, which pollutants do harm, and what is the value of the damage? So these questions must be addressed if you're going to face up to it. So which activities produce pollutant? Is CO2 a pollutant? Then where does it come from? Is CO2 causing harm? And then what harm is it causing? So there are huge problems. If we can answer those three questions and get the required information, and the government knows the marginal cost of pollution, it can set the tax equal to this. So the tax, we'll say tau, is the marginal external cost. So the output tax causes a manufacturer to internalise the externality. So what you're doing is that, as well as bearing the cost of the factors of production, the labour, raw materials, capital that the firm uses, you say an additional cost you face is based on the pollution externality. And we'll impose that in the form of a tax. So now it's imposed into the firm's accounts. They'll still do their profit maximisation, but now it'll be based on the full costs. So looking at the same supply curve as we looked at previously, so we have the demand curve reflecting the benefit to society. We have the MPC, the marginal private curve, reflecting the cost of the firm. And then we have the MEC, the marginal external cost, reflecting the cost of pollution. The free market equilibrium is where the supply and demand curve cross. So the red line is demand, this yellow line here is the supply curve. So EC is the competitive equilibrium. The problem, as we've seen, is that there's a dead weight loss of this. There's excessive production because actually at quantity QC, the cost to society of making the product isn't given by the supply curve here. That's the cost in terms of the factors of production. The cost in terms of the full economic cost is off up here. So for unit QC, the benefits people get, measured by the demand curve, the cost society incurs, the costs far exceed the benefits. So from a society's perspective, it'll be optimum to reduce consumption. Back to this level here, ES. So how do we get firms to produce quantity ES? Well, if you can make this the supply curve. If MSC could become the supply curve. So how do we do that? Well, the gap between them. If you could levy a tax equal to the gap and say, look, this is the cost you get from buying stuff, but also there's a tax imposed from damaging stuff. So in this instance, the MSC is the marginal private cost of the firm plus tau, this Pigouvian tax. This tax that forces them to internalise the external cost. So in the competitive equilibrium, the external cost is sitting down here and the firm ignores it. Pump out the CO2, create the water emissions or water effluent, whatever it might be, damage the environment. Unless the cost is internalised, they won't respond to it, but if you can internalise it, they can. So the after-tax MPC curve is now actually the same as the MSC curve. That this is the supply curve the firm responds to because it's their own private costs plus the tax. So as a result, the after-tax competitive equilibrium is the social optimum. So what happens after the tax? Well, to get the market equilibrium is just where the supply and demand curve cross. The demand curve hasn't changed, but we now have a new supply curve reflecting the tax, and we get our equilibrium here, ES. What do we note here? Well, the benefit given by the demand curve and the cost given by the supply curve are equal. So that is the social optimum. So ES is the social optimum. It requires huge amounts of information, guesswork, and it's perhaps quite difficult to implement. So you can do it maybe locally, but how do you do it globally? If the world decides to impose a tax on CO2, who collects the tax and who gets the tax? So I'll leave it at that for today, and we'll take it up from there tomorrow.